Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Attendance is a little light today. I'm guessing people took 4-day weekends with the closure yesterday. Well, that's all right. They're going to miss out on two terrific people today. Before we dive into those two terrific people, we have two announcements. One is from Xavier Resendez from the Honors Cabinet and Board, and then we've got one about the Biology Club.
Hello. As many of you know, if you got emails, but if you didn't, there's a Stargazing event tonight at 7:30 at the Murillo Family Observatory. The meetup is in the Honors Lounge at 6:45 p.m. It's not necessary, but if you want to hike and be active, you can go and meet up there at the Cajon Hall. And it ends at 9 p.m. Make sure to bring a jacket and water because it gets pretty chilly up there with the winds. And there is going to be snacks, granola bars. It's vegetarian food. It's not vegan. So, thank you.
And Professor Laura Woodney from the Department of Physics is going to be hosting that. She sort of oversees the operations of the observatory. So she'll open up the observatory and let you take a look at the big telescope in there. It's going to be pretty cool, right? So come on in. Next, Biology Club.
Hi everyone, my name is Eileen. I'm a third-year biology student here, and I just wanted to talk about Bio Club real quick and announce, that we're here. We're not exclusive to just biology majors. Like anyone, if you're interested in learning a little bit more, then you can go for it. I just wanted to let you guys know that we're here. It's a good resource to meet other biology students, and honestly, it's like also a really good research to network, because through that I found out different research opportunities. I found out which professors are cool and which professors aren't cool, all that good stuff. But yeah, we have a meeting on Thursday the 31st, and it's going to be fun. If you're interested, check it out. It's called Relieve Your Stress. We're going to be painting pots and planting plants, and it's going to be like a little one-on-one. And I can put our Instagram handle here if you're interested. It'll have our website too on the Instagram. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so she'll put the Instagram handle up there, and you can find out what's going on with the Biology Club. There's all kinds of research that supports or that indicates that students that are engaged in on-campus activities have a higher rate of satisfaction with their own education, do better in their classes, and graduate in 4 years more often than their peers. Right? So find something to get involved even if it's not Biology Club. All right. How we doing? Ready? You have your 3 questions? I've had them prepare 3 questions.
All right.
All right. Okay, so we are very fortunate to have 2 tremendous individuals with us this afternoon. We have Professor Jose Munoz from the Department of Sociology and Professor Caitlin Creasy from the Department of Philosophy. And they're going to be talking to us a bit about disciplinary thinking, how disciplines shape thinking, and maybe we'll get to some questions about whether disciplinary thinking can actually get us as far as we might want to go. Okay? And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves by posing a question about the research, right? Give you a chance to find out what it is they're all about in their professional lives. So can you tell us a little bit about your research? What kinds of questions do you ask, and what kinds of approaches do you take to answering those questions?
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jose Munoz. Can you all hear me? Yeah? So for about 10 years, I was studying what are called migrant hometown associations. Specifically, I was studying organizations formed by Mexican migrants here in the U.S. for the purposes of sending back either money, equipment, or other materials that would help out the communities that those migrants came from. So for example, My dad's from the state of Jalisco, Mexico, and there are a lot of organizations that that formed here in California, in other parts of the Southwest, in Chicago, that send money back home on a regular basis for the purpose of fixing or refurbishing churches, building clinics, putting in potable water, sending pharmaceuticals, that kind of a thing. I steered away from that, and basically that research led to some general interest I have in the Latino community in the U.S. and health. So I have some ongoing projects or some developing projects that fit that area. And then my major project at this time is I'm on a 10-person task force made up of sociologists who are collecting data, information on the experiences of faculty and graduate students who are either first generation or working class, or have working class, come from a working class background. So we're looking at first generation experiences in the academy, as well as working class experiences in the academy. And we've collected focus groups, which involves a lot of group interviewing, okay? Interviewing, let's say, 10 people at a time, asking them questions about a particular topic. We submitted a survey to about 5,000 people who are members of the American Sociological Association. We got about 2,000 responses, and then the next thing that we'll do is we'll collect one-on-one interview data with faculty or graduate students interested in this project.
Katie Creasy in philosophy. In philosophy, research isn't really the aggregation of data or sitting in a lab and doing experiments. It's just reading a lot. So I read a lot about a couple of things, and I usually present on that around the country, around the world, and then get feedback, and people say, your ideas suck. I'm like, okay, gotta change them. So I change them up a little bit, read more. That's what research looks like for philosophers, just reading a ton, writing a ton, presenting out as much as you can. Questions that I'm personally invested in my career, broad questions, sort of typically broad philosophical questions like, what does it look like to live meaningfully? What does a meaningful life look like? Where does meaning come from? Does meaning just come from us? So do we just put meaning into the world, or do we in some way receive meaning from others, from the society or culture to which we belong? So I work specifically on the problem of nihilism, which is the problem of meaninglessness in the history of philosophy. So is life worth living? If it is, why is it worth living? And I do that especially looking at the works of a 19th century German philosopher who you probably have heard of before, Friedrich Nietzsche. He's like the one philosopher people have sometimes heard of. Have you heard of Nietzsche at all? Yeah? Okay. I'm a Nietzsche scholar, so I work on Nietzsche. And I spend most of my research time reading a bunch of Nietzsche scholarship, and trying to figure out for Nietzsche what the problem of meaninglessness is, where he thinks this tendency towards meaninglessness comes from, what beliefs are characteristic of someone who believes they're living meaninglessly, and how we can overcome that, so how we can get on the other side of that. In particular, I look at affective nihilism, so it's nihilism or meaninglessness as a feeling. So it's not just beliefs like, I don't think life is worth living, or life has no value. It's what that feels like. So I worked especially on looking at what Nietzsche thinks meaninglessness feels like. And for Nietzsche, meaninglessness feels a little bit like this. Like, I have goals that I'd like to accomplish. I have aims and ends in the world that I'd like to accomplish, towards which I'm sort of striving. And I have those sort of foiled over and over again until eventually I stop engaging in the world in that same kind of way. And then the problem of affective nihilism, or the problem of nihilism as a feeling-based phenomenon or as an emotional phenomenon, is how do I re-engage with the world? And what tools might Nietzsche give us to re-engage with the world? Kind of different, right? Super broad, super philosophical. Research methods are different. I read a ton and don't do so much field work, for example. Although I will say that I also work in environmental philosophy. And so my work in environmental philosophy, some of it informed by the stuff I do in Nietzsche and meaning. is a bit more applied. We'll get to that in a little bit, I think. And so my work in environmental philosophy asks, what's our role in the natural world? How ought we to treat other than human nature and things like that? And then in that kind of work, I can work with people outside of my discipline a little bit more. So I can work with policymakers, conservation biologists, to think through where meaning's coming from in the natural world, because that's not something you can just sort of sit in an armchair and think about. You need to be engaged with other people who know the different aims and ends that other than human life forms have. So, yeah.
Thank you. Do you guys, anybody have a question they want to throw out before I move on to my next one? I know you got questions.
They're written down somewhere.
Yeah? Yeah, Desi.
I have a question about, you said you were going to get to environmental philosophy.
I was going, what?
Environmental philosophy? You said you were
Yeah, so I have just 2 different research specializations. In philosophy, you sort of have to pick a little area, and then that's the one you read a ton about, right, and present on a bunch. So one is Nietzsche, but then one is environmental philosophy, yep. And so that could be environmental ethics, so what is the way that we ought to treat the natural world, but it's broader than that. So we can ask, is it even possible in a world so dominated by human-caused climate change to have wilderness anymore? Like, that's an environmental philosophy question, too.
Oh, that's cool.
It is cool. It's cool as hell.
That's a good question.
I have a question. Do you guys ever think about or discuss animal rights when you're considering environmental philosophy?
Yeah, sometimes, and it depends on the emphasis of the individual philosopher. So for some reason, I think it's completely accidental, and it could be totally changed. The domain of animal rights in philosophy is separated off from environmental philosophy, because animal rights has to do a lot more, typically in philosophical discourse, with domesticated animals or animals being used for agriculture. And those aren't always the kinds of life forms that environmental philosophers are talking about or are interested in, but that's not to say they shouldn't be interested in them. And if you're an environmental philosopher, often what you're doing is trying to figure out what the values of other life forms are. So you might not be into animal ethics or animal rights, but you might think, oh, I notice when I go out in the world that I have my own interests and that these other animals and life forms need to have their own interests, like goals they're trying to accomplish, and I can get in the way of those, or I can help those. And then you can kind of extrapolate from that to the context of animal rights and think like, okay, maybe these domesticated animals who aren't out there like trotting through the forest also might have some interests that are not necessarily being respected. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I don't know. Are we calling on people or?
If you would like to. No, Desi, why don't you do one more and then I'm going to ask one of mine.
Okay. So I heard you mention like the environmental philosophy, and I thought that was super cool. So how does that work to implement changes into, like, let's say climate change or any changes into the environment itself?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Philosophy gets this bad rap, I think, of being kind of disconnected or detached from the real world. So I'm here today to convince you that's not the case. But in environmental philosophy, I got into environmental philosophy because I did feel sometimes like the work I was doing in Nietzsche, which is largely Nietzsche interpretation, what did Nietzsche think about this, sort of history of philosophy stuff, was a little bit removed. And I cared so much about the natural world, so I just thought, what can I do in my philosophical career that could matter a bit more and also be a kind of vocation for me? So it's something that I naturally care about, that I'm passionate about. And so environmental philosophy stuff came out of that kind of aim. In my case, it's kind of obvious, and I'm really lucky, because I work on critiquing particular environmental policies, and especially making the case that certain environmental policies, especially those that prioritize natural resources and human interests over non-human interests, I argue that those are anthropocentric and damaging, harmful, and that they block us from seeing other sources of value out there in the world apart from our own. So if you present that to someone who's constructing policy, they might say, no, I don't care, but it might get them thinking. And then they really might think about the ways they're implementing those policies and the unintended effects that they might have, even if in the short run they look good.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for this. Okay, I want to turn you a little bit more broadly now to ask if you can explain what are the bigger questions that your disciplines tend to ask? What do they ask questions about? And Kate, you answered this a little bit. Jose, you have it a little bit as well. But if you had to characterize your discipline in terms of the kinds of questions it asks, the methodologies it uses to answer those questions, the kinds of answers it's looking for, how would you make that characterization?
Well, I think one of the things we ask is, what is it like to be a member of a group, right? In a very general sense, what is it like to be a group member? What happens when different groups interact? And then we can begin to explore themes like I'm covering in my qualitative research class, which is what happens when different ethnic groups interact. What does it mean to be a part of a particular ethnic group, and how does that ethnic group interact with another? And then we can get even more specific. Having my students read a book called Becoming Neighbors, and it's about how Mexican Americans treat Mexican immigrants. So what's interesting about that book is when we think about ethnic conflict or inter-ethnic conflict, which is a major theme in our discipline, we often think about white, non-white conflict. We don't think about within group member or group or community conflicts. So most would think all Mexicans are alike or all get along, but when you think about a native-born population and an immigrant population, a lot of the same kinds of conflicts emerge that you might see within mainstream society. And I suppose another major theme I like to talk about in my classes, or one of the larger sections or population of scholars that we have in sociology, is folks that study gender. How is gender constructed, right? How do we learn to play a particular role, right? We think about gender for many as sort of coming out of our biology, but within sociology, we tend to think about it as a socialization process, right? We learn to perform a particular gender, right? And we are stigmatized when we do not successfully perform that gender. So social construction, inter-ethnic relationships, right? These are some of the major themes I think a lot of sociologists seek to tackle. And I think a lot of the ways people make fun of sociology, even sociologists, we study race, class, and gender, right? So a lot of our projects have to do with those three concepts, or experiences, I suppose.
No, I know in English, being an English professor, we think a lot about race, class, and gender as well, the way that literary texts construct notions of race, class, and gender. So, I don't know, maybe that begins to point to places of cross-disciplinarity, maybe cross-pollination from discipline to discipline.
Well, when you started to talk about meaninglessness, I mean, I talk about, or I have my students write a paper on alienation and alienation at work, and how does the job that you have alienate you from yourself, essentially?
Yeah.
How does it put you on a track to live out this sort of meaningless existence at a particular job? I think that is universal for a lot of workers, and I think a lot of you have warehouse jobs or Starbucks jobs or McDonald's kinds of jobs, and those jobs do sort of separate you from who you are, because who you are cannot enter that work because work wants you to be a particular way, and it has no room for you.
Yeah, totally. And just to piggyback on that, and then also to piggyback a little bit on race, class, gender, then I'll talk about some philosophy questions. I mean, there are a lot of questions. But yeah, Jean-Paul Sartre talks about this, I'm going to say phenomenon a lot, just because it's the broadest way to talk about a thing. So Jean-Paul Sartre talks about this phenomenon called bad faith, and he has this example in his text of a waiter just acting out the perfect waiterly role. And think about what that looks like, right? They're sort of like seamlessly moving, they're waiting on tables, they're smiling at all the right moments. And his critique of this, and the reason why he calls it bad faith, is for this reason: this waiter is totally alienated from himself, and so Jean-Paul Sartre would say he's acting completely inauthentically. And so we can analyze authenticity and inauthenticity, and ultimately in philosophy we can ask whether authenticity is a really good ideal to aim for anyway. But we're dealing with these same kinds of issues, and there is philosophy of race. This is when I say there are a lot of questions. there's like a philosophy of blank everything. So there's philosophy of race, there's philosophy of gender. I don't know about philosophy of class, but philosophers certainly think about class, especially
Did you
in...
say that Marx was a philosopher?
He is, right? I'm thinking about like classes one might take. Philosophy of class won't be there, but certainly class concerns will be there. They'll be ever present. But talking about the social construction of gender, for example, Judith Butler, someone really important for someone with a theoretical underpinning of the sort of sociological work that's being done, is widely considered a philosopher or a gender theorist.
Yeah.
And her work on performing gender and what it means to be a particular gender, or to be performing a gender not as well as you should, to be performing a sort of alternative gender that then gets policed by the others around you, that's been really helpful, I think, for applying that then to concrete circumstances and sociological work.
Yeah. I think this example of the waiter, Goffman would say, Goffman wrote about dramaturgy, and for you that are servers or are trying to figure out a way to interact with your professor or someone else at work, Goffman would point out that we project a particular front stage, a particular part of ourselves that is idealistic in many ways, but we do that because we're trying to navigate a particular setting, and that setting requires a particular kind of performance to be successful. Okay, so it could be characterized as inauthentic, and I suppose in many ways it is. But in order to be successful, the societal context requires you to perform a particular way, or else you will not be successful. Right? Coming up to your professor with your hat pulled down, mumbling, is not a successful performance for meeting your particular need. Right? How is the instructor to read that? Yeah, and so, and how do we learn these things? Right? How do we learn these things? How do we learn? How do we learn them and be successful in a university setting? Let's say, how do you learn them at work? You know, where do we get these kinds of practices for success? Let's say.
Yeah, and that's the question about if authenticity should be an ideal at all in the first place. I mean, we're kind of drawn to it. We like to be ourselves. But should authenticity be an ideal? For example, I'm a young philosophy professor, and I often get mistaken for a student, which is very frustrating sometimes. But I'll go to conferences where I'm presenting on the program, and if I just acted like a slob, I would be read a certain way. And that's unfortunate, but it's an unfortunate social reality. So if I want to be taken seriously, unfortunately, I can't be authentic. I'm not authentically a slob. But you know what I mean. You know what I mean.
Yeah. That inauthentic part we save for our friends, our family, right? Where we just sort of let go, right? You're not going to clip your toenails out in public, right? You do that in the backstage, right? In the part of that space where you can just be yourself and not worry about what others might be thinking of.
Can I say one more thing about philosophical questions? Because I don't think I got there yet. Why is the number one philosophical question, I think. Why is the world this way? Why do I think what I think? Should I think what I think? Should I be acting this way? Why or why not? So why should I be acting this way? Why shouldn't I be authentic? Why should I be authentic? Philosophy is nothing but questions and trying to solve them. So there's just a whole host of questions. There's questions about how the world is. There are questions about what it means to be human, how I am. There are questions about how I ought to act. Those are ethical questions. There are questions about knowledge. What do I know? And how do I know that I know what I know? These are all philosophical questions.
I love those questions. I think every student minor in philosophy.
Well, and the how do I know that I know does have a research component, because when you're doing field work, when you're doing research on a particular community, how do you know that you've collected all the information that you need for your project? It's at that point where you don't get anything new. And so that's one of the ways you could say right? The 100th trip into this particular community is not revealing anything new. And so that might be a good sign that you're done. and it's time to move on to write or do other aspects of your project.
Well, it seems like assessment of student learning, which is a big thing in higher education, especially over the last 15 years, right? Faculty are being asked to demonstrate that students are learning what we set out to help students to learn, right? It seems like philosophers should be all over this, right? Because even if it's got a reputation of being a bureaucratic pain in the backside, right? But it's all about epistemology.
Yeah.
It's all about how do we know if we know, how do we know if they know.
And in fact, I think one of our philosophers on the faculty is in charge of assessment in some capacity at this university. So they're involved.
Yeah, Professor Moma.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Does anybody know Professor Moma?
Professor Mumma,
He does
logic.
His class last year. Yeah.
he has some wild philosophy classes.
Yeah. Questions coming up for you guys? Yeah, Xavier.
So going back to cultural interactions, when cultures interact with one another, do you see patterns emerge from one region to another? And if you do see patterns emerge, are you able to apply that pattern into like a template almost?
Well,
From one region to another?
a lot of projects, that's what, so if you want to publish something, you have to show some kind of pattern or set of themes, right? Some tendency that you think is relevant to spell out. And in many cases, you will not have your work published unless you can clearly block what particular pattern you found in a coherent way. And in social science, this is pretty normal. I mean, we're looking for patterns of conflict or patterns of rejection. How do assimilation patterns change over time? Right, but yeah, we are required in many cases to do that. Otherwise, a lot of times our work is ignored.
How much of the work of philosophy is looking for patterns?
I mean, I was thinking along publication lines, and usually in philosophy, you are trying to disprove a pattern of thinking. So you're trying to notice when you have these patterns of thinking that need to be disrupted or changed, and sort of point that out a bit. But I taught philosophy of oppression and marginalization, and of course that's all about recognizing patterns of oppression and marginalization and how those appear. So there's a relationship there. It depends on the context a bit, I think. But it's not the same. I mean, you do have to find these social patterns to say that this is what a social group is doing to begin with. In philosophy, we work on things like intuition. So we try to say, like, what's your ethical intuition? If I slapped Jose right now, would you be like, what the heck, that's not right? Yeah, you would. And that's a kind of pattern that we might point out, right? We might say, like, that's something we all agree on. So we do in that sense, once we're sort of pumping for intuitions for ethical scenarios, we do look for patterns and responses. But then we also question those patterns, so we don't necessarily trust our intuition. So it's a bit tricky.
Okay, English works the same way, right? We're always looking for patterns across and in literary texts. But I think, in addition, we're very intrigued by the anomalies, right? We're interested in trying to explain why an anomaly is there and what that anomaly means. So, other questions coming up for you all? Okay, well, I'm going to throw one of mine then. Would it be fair in your discipline to differentiate between pure and applied research? And if so, what do those terms mean in your disciplinary context?
Well, in sociology, there are different kinds of rewards, you could say, for pure versus applied. So this ASA task force that I pointed out, we're collecting 3 kinds of information, and based on that, we're going to submit something to the journal in sociology. And that's something I never imagined for myself as a researcher because of the kind of work that I do and the time that I have to do my research. This particular project is going to lend itself. And when we do eventually publish in this very top journal, it's going to allow for me to do things with my career that, let's say, all the previous publications maybe didn't have as much as much leverage. So a lot of sociology pushes us to be pure researchers, but there are these areas within sociological thinking that include applied research. So a lot of it has to do with community-based research, community-based participatory research. A lot of that has to do with people studying health in communities, or studying how do you evaluate certain programs within educational institutions. And then there's also the non-sociological thinking about what we do, or the non-sociologist thinking about what we do. So even though we do all of this research, I think if you were to ask people, what do sociologists do? A lot of them would say social work. Our discipline has nothing to do with social work. But because it's hard to place our particular discipline with some applied or eventual job, a lot of the work seems like, oh, well, this seems natural for social work, and maybe it is, but we have sociologists that end up working in law enforcement, sociologists that end up working in hospitals, sociologists that end up working in educational institutions, research, universities. And so there are different kinds of applicability, but we don't really think about that outside of social work or some other kind of social service kind of thinking. And that is the sort of frustrating part of sociology, and part of it is our fault, because one of the things that contributes to what people think about sociology is we don't often do a good job advocating or publicizing what we do. And maybe in the last 8 years we've tried to do a better job of this, but we don't necessarily think about our work as public, right? Our work isn't necessarily for a mass audience in the way journalism is. So we're also responsible for that lack of understanding of our particular discipline.
Ditto on that last part. Philosophy, right? It sounds just like it's nothing but pure thinking.
Yeah.
And that is the fault of philosophers up till now, who sometimes have just done what they saw as pure thinking, kind of removed from the world, just figuring out these really tricky puzzles in ivory towers somewhere off. And we have the same sort of, I guess, this trend in our field too, to prioritize pure thinking as opposed to applied or more grounded approaches. So take it or it's tricky. I mean, philosophers would do well to make the case whenever possible that philosophy actually matters for life. But that being said, not all philosophy will actually matter for life sometimes. So think of it this way. I'll give you one example of a kind of question that we can ask. We can ask, are we really in this room right now? That's a question that philosophers ask. So there's a possibility, granted it might be a small one, that you're a brain in a vat being stimulated by electrodes right now. And this is just the experience produced from that stimulation. How do you know you're not a brain in a vat? You're like, I don't know. You don't know. But you're not that troubled. You're like, okay, but it's fine. I'm going to keep living this brain in a vat life and going to CSUSB and doing my thing. So there are very pure questions like that, where sometimes it's hard to see the takeaway. It's hard to see where it lands. It's certainly interesting, and if you like ideas for ideas' sake, it's kind of curious, it's kind of cool, but it doesn't always land. Alternatively, there are a number of areas of philosophy that are much more applied almost explicitly sometimes. So there will be applied ethics, and there are certain subdomains of applied ethics where we talk about ethical questions in the medical field, and then we say, well, we recommend this course of action in this particular case, et cetera, and that's like very clearly applied, not just pure thinking. But of course it needs the theory in the background to be grounding it, so that it's giving you that direction that you need and the reasons why you ought to do what you do in that particular applied situation. Environmental philosophy is applied. There is a real distinction in philosophy between pure and applied, and it has the same sort of issues that sociology does, where the pure theory is sometimes prioritized over applied work. But it depends on trends. I mean, more so and less so. So the people getting jobs right now in philosophy, for example, because philosophy job market is tricky, are not people necessarily doing the theoretical work, but are doing work that they can make matter to you guys. in a classroom so that you take more philosophy classes because it matters. It's interesting. Like you want to think about how to make your world a better place and how to treat the environment and how to think about things like oppression. So that's a lot.
It also depends on how we're thinking about the word applied, right? So is applied doing a survey? And if the answer is yes, that's just one area within sociology. And then there's this other extreme where we talk about applied community-based research where, let's say, on the most community-involved level, there are practitioners that say the community should decide what the research question is, the community should decide how to collect the data, and the community should decide how that data would be interpreted and presented. And so in that way, the researcher subsumes their power in that relationship to the community organization or community group that they're trying to help, okay? And that kind of work is definitely not rewarded within sociology, right? We went through this whole survey within our campus about how to read or how to think about faculty's contributions to community organizations, and that's a sign that this university has just begun to think about those kinds of contributions. Within sociology, right, this kind of work is sort of on the side, right? If you were to talk to a sociologist who does community-based research, they often talk about it, well, this is when I'm not doing the projects that I was hired to do and that I'm expected to do, okay? So that's another kind of applied work that isn't recognized or ill-recognized.
Can I say just two more things?
Yeah.
Now I'm wanting to walk back like half of what I said. Typical of a philosopher, I'm already asking like, why did I say that? Why did I think that? Yeah, I mean, the question of reward is interesting. And it depends on what you mean by rewarded. Rewarded within the discipline, that's a thing, right? Like, are people in your discipline going to care about what you're doing? And this is why I mentioned a little bit about why applied philosophy in the domains of environmental philosophy or bioethics or philosophy of race and gender, those things that are more applied, that are more real life. People are getting hired, people are getting jobs now, and it's kind of a trendy field right now. Unfortunately that some of those topics are trends, of course, but they're trendier. So you are actually, in the discipline of philosophy, sometimes getting rewarded for pursuing certain things along those lines. Second point is that, okay, brains and facts, I tried to think of the most detached example ever, but you could think of ways in which that would apply to your life. And I think also that some of the questions that I ask in my own research and in my classes sound really abstract and sound like they're not all that applied, like they don't have like very clear, concrete takeaways. Like, what's the meaning of life? Where does the meaning of life come from? And that sounds like the kind of conversation you just sit in a room and have with your buddies, and then you leave the room and you're like, screw it, who cares? But of course, we all want to live meaningfully. So we ought to take that pure question really seriously and start thinking about how we would answer it. And in that way, a question that looks pure or detached is not as pure and detached as it seems. There are things you can do with it. Like it does in fact matter if you start to think about it. And it can shape the way that you live your life. What's more applied than that?
That's really interesting. Sorry, stimulated thinking for me. How do you guys, questions?
I have a,
All right, Desi, go
I
for it.
don't know if there's anybody else. Oh, okay. I had a question about like the philosophy thing.
Uh-huh.
So when you come to your conclusions, do you use like logic, like
Mhm.
at all, like because I remember I had to do that for one quarter for an honors class. Is that like how you come to most of your conclusions?
Yeah, that is how you come to most of your conclusions. You need to be able to make a strong and convincing case, even to people who disagree with the conclusion that you get to, or believe at the beginning that they disagree with the conclusion that you're getting to. So you do have to make sure that you are making a strong argument, and that means that the points of your argument all need to connect together in the right sort of way. And then sometimes, of course, you appeal to experience in the course of it too. So you have your strong argument, and then you want to convince people that your argument's correct. And so you do things like appeal to intuitions and say, if I did this, wouldn't you all think that would be horrible? Oh great, we all think that's horrible, so that must say something about our moral intuitions, and you bring that back into the argument. So you do sometimes also appeal to the world in this way. And some philosophers are interested not just in making cases on particular topics, but on deconstructing and analyzing certain themes. And in that case, there are arguments to be made, and you still are, of course, using critical thinking and logic to do that, and to think about how all the parts of it hang together. But it looks a little bit different, right? So there's this feminist philosopher named Sandra Barkey who talks about oppression as a psychological experience. So those who are members of oppressed groups in a society often experience something called, according to Barkey, psychological oppression. And that's when you come to internalize the things that your society believes about you or tells you about yourself. And you come to see yourself through that lens. Now she's making an argument there. There's logic there. But you do have to be living a life to sort of really reflect and think if that seems true. It seems to me that it's true. But there's more than just the argument there. You see what I mean?
Thank you.
Raises a question for me.
I have a question. So is there multiple right answers in philosophy then, or is it just based off a matter of opinion?
Yeah, so philosophy has this really interesting reputation, I think, sometimes, for just being like, oh yeah, any answer can be right because, any answer can be right because there are multiple right answers. And every answer cannot be right. You need to give good reasons for the answers that you're giving. You need to support your claims. And truth isn't as black and white as we think it is. We're not always certain that our conclusion is right, but we want to make the best case that we can. So if you make a better case for your claim, something that's genuinely more convincing, then that's more right than something that's not. Do you see what I mean? So, are there right answers in philosophy? There are bad arguments, and there are good arguments. I think that's the most I'm willing to say. I don't want to take a stance on it.
I think in literary studies, for me, I've arrived at this point to teaching students that there are no right answers, but there are wrong answers.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's all about the strength of the argument you're making.
Yep. And real quick. I think there are definitely wrong claims you can make. There are falsehoods. If someone sits in my philosophy class and tells me that racism isn't real, I'm gonna be like, LOL, that's false. Right? So you can't just believe whatever you want to believe just because you believe it. You can't give a good argument for that. So that's what I mean by there are good arguments and bad arguments. And I was trying to think in my head at the moment, do I want to say wrong answers? You can say wrong things. The earth is square. No, it's not. But you probably don't know why it's round. Or how we know. No. Okay, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I was going to say the best answer that I would have for this question that sociology could bring comes from a professor I had in my PhD program. She said, when we're thinking about projects and developing methodologies to collect certain kinds of data, what you're hoping for is to be farther from ignorance, right? And that, you maybe don't get at the truth or all the truth, but you're farther from ignorance. You've learned just a little bit more than what we knew as a discipline before.
That's awesome.
Yeah, Xavier?
So when you take a survey for a region, there's a lot of numbers and figures involved, and those numbers and figures they can quickly take over the social and human aspect of it. So how do you keep the survey also human aspect?
Yeah, I typically don't do surveys, but in this project that I mentioned, yes, we have these 2,000 surveys, but we have 120 pages coming from these 4 focus groups that we ran. So 10 people were in each of these 4 focus groups, right? And so someone wrote down word for word what was said in that focus group. So we have that information from people in a room that we can begin to compare or add to this 2,000 set of responses, okay? And then what's going to add to this research, or the last part of the data that we'll be collecting has to do with, we're probably going to collect 50 interviews And those interviews will be each probably an hour, right? And so we'll have a transcription for each of those interviews. So from those 3 sources of data, right, we're gonna have a pretty clear picture of the experiences of first generation and working class people in sociology, right? And so the focus group data, the interview data, allows us to bring people in, right? That's the phrase that sociologists like to use, bring people in or pay attention to the voices, yeah? What are the voices of the respondent or the subject, right? So in that particular case, we're combining different kinds of methods to make sure that we're not glossing over or missing things that let's say a survey would do. But sometimes you can't do that, right? The government collects the census every 10 years. It's really hard to collect focus group data on an entire population, so the survey is what we got, although we could probably do a little bit of interviewing, but it's not going to give us, it's impossible, or it would take 10 years just to collect that data, and the government would be is more focused on analyzing all those responses taken from close to 360 million people. So sometimes a survey is all that you can do, right? Because of the question that you're asking and the population that you're trying to explain, yeah? And then of course there are times where surveys are just inappropriate, they're just impossible to collect, right? So in my qualitative research class, I talk to my students about a lot of the gang research that goes on, right? You can't collect survey data on gangs, it's not, you're not gonna answer your survey. So it involves a researcher essentially hanging out with gang members, gang organizations. So, it depends on what kind of question you're trying to ask and what methodology is relevant for that particular question.
Yeah, this is raising a question for me that I think both of you were talking about implicitly, but maybe we need to make this explicit. This is not a question I sent you in advance, so.
Uh-oh.
Off the top of your head, what counts as evidence in your discipline? Right? Assuming that what most disciplines have in common is that we make arguments about things. Right? In the natural sciences, we call that argument a theory. Right? And there's evidence to support it. But we make arguments in most disciplines. So what counts as evidence in the arguments you make in your discipline?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on the research question, but it would involve the elements I've been talking about is, what are the responses to a survey, and are those survey respondent, is the sample that we've collected on a particular population credible, okay? But that's when it comes to survey work. If you're doing field work on a social movement organization in the US, at what point do you have enough evidence that says you understand the internal dynamics of a particular social movement organization? And what does that evidence look like? So it could be observations, it could be interviews, it could be newspaper or publications that particular organization forms. And so those are the kinds of evidence that we would point to. But there are other kinds of evidence. What are the ways in which Latinos are portrayed in popular culture? What do those images look like, right? What are the patterns of those what are the patterns of those portrayals? How do they manifest? What is the latent message behind those particular portrayals, right? And so I guess that evidence comes from looking at these sources of data and interpreting them from your perspective, right? From your set of research tools that you have and the training that you have, and coming up with the best possible argument. Right?
Does philosophy differ?
A bit. Sometimes, maybe yes, maybe no. I've been sitting over here trying to think, like, what counts as evidence in philosophy? Geez, that's a hard question. And it depends on what kind of philosophy you're doing, and it depends on which philosopher you talk to a little bit. So there are different fields in philosophy and different schools of philosophy that count different things as evidence. So there's one subfield in philosophy that, right, like evidence is what goes into making a good argument, and so true claims claims that are true about the world that correspond to the world in a particular way. Like those are good true claims, and we count those as evidence. They make our arguments sound when they show up. And then, of course, like implicit in that is the idea that these claims are true for everyone. And then it gets really tricky. Another subfield called phenomenology, which I'll eventually be teaching a class in, y'all should take it, is looking much more to lived experience for evidence. So your evidence, if you're doing phenomenology, is sort of reflecting on experience, and you're trying to reflect on your own experience, and think about maybe what those broad structures of experience are. So I can give you one example, like orientation towards the future. Sounds super abstract, but do y'all got goals? Like, do y'all got aims? That's orientation towards the future. And that's something that if we reflect on our own experience, we see it in us. And then we can kind of deconstruct it and say like, okay, well, as humans, we all have this orientation to a future. That seems to be a really important part of being a human. I take that bit of my lived experience and compare it with others' lived experience as evidence for that structure of existence. So it depends. It's really tough. That's the toughest question I've gotten in a long time.
Yeah, and I have a project that I'm developing that essentially will take a phenomenological approach. I'm not going to reveal the project because sociologists are pretty, like a lot of scholars, are paranoid about
Poaching?
Yeah, not that you're about to poach, but I'm interested in. Let's say I'm interested in one particular discipline that Latino faculty are present in, and the project will eventually explore their experiences within that discipline, right? And what does that say about their ability to do X?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I should say, by the way, that there have been a ton of really great and helpful sociological analyses on experiences of faculty in philosophy, especially because philosophy, on the whole, historically has been a very white, very male, very cisgender group of people. So there are definitely sociological analyses of people from all different backgrounds in philosophy and their different experiences depending on how they find themselves fitting in or not. But for the record, I'm doing it. People do it.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah, right?
So when you're doing research, like sometimes you might have to go to other disciplines to like fully, execute your goal or whatever. How do you insert yourself from being from one discipline to insert yourself into another discipline in order to make your goal a reality, whatever?
It requires a lot of reading, especially if that discipline is either completely outside of what you do or, I'll take, for example, the area of health. Most of my work has involved social movements in Latin America and the transnational relationships they have between Latin America and the US, let's say. I'm interested in Latino health issues, but this is an entirely different area of the discipline, the area of research in comparison to social movements. So it's required a lot of, and I'm at a point where I realize now that there's never a point I can really catch up because most of my work, most of my training has been in social movements. So when I'm looking to collaborate with others, I'm hoping that who I'm collaborating can begin to fill in some of those gaps, let's say in Latino health that I have. And as far as collaboration, part of it involves putting yourself out there and letting people know that you're open to different kinds of topics outside of what you do, and then maybe you yourself are not totally invested in leading a project all the time. That you're okay with just playing a supplemental role. Yeah.
I'll also say a lot of reading and an attitude of humility going in, because you don't want to just bust into somebody's discipline and be like, no, I'm the new sociology expert in the room. Because people have spent their lives doing this work and they deserve to be respected for their work and what they're doing. They've been doing for a long time. They know what they're doing. So you just have to read and read and read as much as you can to even start to get yourself oriented truly, especially when it's not as obvious of a disciplinary fit. So there are some disciplinary fits that are maybe a bit more of a stretch sometimes, and that's just the case. So for philosophy, for example, it's really easy for me to read stuff in religious studies and to read stuff in particular areas of literature and to start seeing resonances there. And I'm not going to think I'm the expert of religious studies, this subfield, or of this particular field of literature, but you can kind of think next to each other a little bit more easily. Whereas my work in environmental philosophy, for example, like I had to have my conservation biologist friend for me one day explain patch dynamics. Do you know what patch dynamics are? They're like an ecological theory. It's right, it's the most current ecological theory that we have, but I was trying to teach part ecology in my class and trying to incorporate that into my philosophical work, and I had to learn that. I had to be taught that by another professor. And that's the thing, you read or you get taught by the experts, and you always go in with an attitude of humility, thinking, okay, you're the one who can teach me, so, give it a go. And then you just hope that you have collaborators who are friendly, who also take your discipline seriously. There are times where philosophy won't be taken seriously, or I can talk to, I'm lucky that I have a bunch of nice conservation biology friends, but I can imagine plenty of conservation biologists who think like, philosophy, who cares? Like, we're figuring it out, we're doing this thing over here, leave us alone. So friendly collaborators too, a willingness for them to see that it matters, that I'm bringing something to conservation policy that is working with what they're doing, but also doing something a little different. So, yeah, I want to echo what Jose said. I think the spirit also of what Jose said is, don't try to go in as the expert.
Yeah.
Read, it's required.
We're about out of time.
All right.
Final questions? All right, then please help me thank our panelists. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. Again, our goal today is really going to think about disciplinary thinking. I think Marley ended us on a good place, and that is there are limits to disciplinary thinking, right?
It was not a bad thing.
And sometimes there's a need to look outside your own discipline in order to fill in around the constraints that your discipline may have, right? Okay, on your way out, please leave your questions on one of the back tables, and we'll pick them up there. And have a great weekend.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thanks so much for inviting us.
That was good. So nice to see the next one.
Yeah, totally. I know. It was kind of like a good exercise for us too.
Okay, let's. Can you email honors at
I made it. I had them done. And I even asked questions.
and we'll talk through everything you
I'm just gonna. I'm so tired, but I have to do a meeting because those freckles. They're so cute. Oh my gosh. Oh, you see her makeup? It's so cute. She's got freckles. Yes.
No, we had 2 interviews. We're hiring an
That's so
environmental.
cute. What was the inspiration? Like,
It's a completely new area.
I was putting yellow, and then I wanted to put orange, and then it became like a pumpkin thing, and then
And we have a great pool. So the dumb part was voting. The 3 that
but
we're
we,
gonna pick.
me and Nick Show might go to the pumpkin patch.
Yeah, it's a good problem.
So
It is.
I
Yeah,
should
they're all
make
very
the-
strong.
oh, looks so nice. Like, go to your flannel. I appreciate it. I don't know how you do
Yeah,
it.
and then in
But if you
geography,
put
they have an
a tutorial, I'll
environmental
watch
justice
it
side, and
because
apologize
I
for
can
that.
use it. Not gonna lie. I have to go. I have a meeting
Yeah, I was
to
wondering
do,
who else was doing it.
and
Because in my
I am
old-
dead.
at my
So
old
I only got
institution where I
4
worked
hours
for a
sleep.
while,
Oh, there's Daniel.
we were all together in the same college, and so now
Please help.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Please help me.
in college.
Because I need a meeting for
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah,
Everyone already did their meeting, and I'm kind of like the last person.
Yeah, you're gonna look at it right now. Are
It's
you?
been interesting.
No,
Yeah.
I'm busy. I just need to get it done.
Yeah, sure. It's not super.
Can I ask a weird question?
Got it.
How weird.
See you guys.
What's
Des, do you mind putting, oh, I want a flag for sure.
I'll take an extra word.
Is it like
Poverty?
one?
No.
Wait,
Sex?
Des, wait for me.
I mean, it could be.
Wait for me.
Small.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe possibly extra small. You can just like pull it up. If the small looks too big, I'm not that big. I wear this big blazer to try to look. So, exactly. Just you can ask Justin. Just show him two shirts. Which one is Katie?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
Awesome.
all right.
Coolio.
This is for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. With the Nietzsche article.
Yes.
Good deal.
It's sort of a review of some recent Nietzsche scholarship.
Yeah, you know what? See,
Bye, Jose, thank you.
I saw it posted about by a couple people on Facebook, but I haven't actually seen the whole thing.
Yeah.
So,
Well, there
thanks,
you go.
man.
You got it.
All right, and we're on for the hike.
Sounds good.
Okay. Let us know.
All right.
And no pressure. I mean, we can also think of a place. I was just thinking if you have a place or.
Yeah, you know, with my involvement in scouting, we tended to do the same hikes year after year.
Uh-huh.
So there's only like one that comes to mind.
Well, if it's one you like, we're down. But we can also, if you're bored of it, we can do something else too.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
let us know your thoughts.
All right, cool.
All right, man.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too.